Mrs. Murphy has just finished marking this term's maths test. Sitting at her desk at the front of the empty classroom, she scans the list of names and grades and notices, not for the first time, a pattern emerging in the scores. The pupils at the top of the list, with the highest marks, are almost all from what she thinks of as nice homes, where there are books and parents with the time to read with them. They're the children who are less likely to get in trouble, less likely to make bad decisions. She wishes she could say the same for those at the bottom of the list, but most of the lowest scores come from the children who live in the poorest part of town. Some of them, she knows, have difficult home lives. Maybe that's why they do badly, she thinks. Or maybe it's genetics. Or maybe a growing number of scientists are saying there's something else going on. Simply being poor could be affecting the pupils' brains. I'm Ruth Alexander. This is The Inquiry, and this week we're asking, does poverty change the way you think?
Part 1. Overload.
I look terrible when I'm time poor. All of a sudden, you're late to the first meeting, which makes you late to the second meeting, and everything derails.
Are you known for that?
No comment.
Our first expert witness, Eldar Shafir, doesn't have enough time because he's a busy professor of behavioural science and public policy at Princeton University in the US. He co-wrote a book about being short of things like time or money and called it Scarcity. Does poverty change the way we think?
Yes. Shall I talk about it now?
Sure.
You ask a group of people to maintain a 7-digit number in their head. Can you remember 7426249? And as you keep that in short-term memory, try not to forget it. Your mind is literally loaded. You just have less cognitive space for other things.
You might be less likely to notice things going on in the periphery. You might forget things.
And a lot of the work we've done suggests that basically living in poverty, having to juggle insufficient resources, constantly thinking about trade-offs, worrying about how you're going to cover the month, how you're going to put lunch on the table on Friday, those kinds of concerns, end up looking a lot like walking around with a 7-digit number in your head.
He says a way to think about it is that we all have a finite amount of what he calls bandwidth.
We talk a lot about bandwidth, yes. So bandwidth is this limited attentional resource you have. That's the one we use to take care of our finances, remember to pay the parking meter on time, remember to take our medication, help our kids with their homework.
And Eldar Shafir says he's demonstrated this is going on in an experiment he carried out in a mall in New Jersey. He gave shoppers one of 2 car repair problems to think about. Some were given a manageable problem, some a challenging one. It's all basically about money.
The manageable problem, the car is going to cost you $150 to fix. The challenging problem is that the car is going to cost you $1,500 to fix.
While the shoppers were mulling the problem over, thinking how they'd find the money to fix their car, Eldar Shafir gave them some cognitive tests to do, like you see a series of shapes following a pattern, one's missing, and you have to work out what it is.
And what you found is that the rich people, when they think about the manageable or the more challenging car, perform just as well on these classic cognitive attention and intelligence tests.
And the poor? They did just as well as the rich when they were given the manageable car problem to think about, the repairs costing $150.
But when they're worried about the car they cannot afford to fix, the one that's a massive challenge, they just do less well. They literally score lower. It's as if they have lower IQ.
At a group level, and we are generalising here, talking about what the average effect was. At a group level, Eldar Shafir says you can compare the effect of being distracted by an unaffordable cost to a loss of 12 to 13 IQ points.
And that's enough to take you from average to borderline gifted or from average to borderline deficient. That's a substantial amount.
Remarkable, he thought. But Eldar Shafir couldn't be absolutely sure that it was poverty that was driving these results. The people who did less well in the test didn't just tend to be poorer, there were other differences too.
They're less educated, they're typically less healthy. Who knows, maybe there was something going on when you give them challenging problems.
So he and his colleagues began looking round for some other people to study. And
kind of nature helped us.
they found a group of sugarcane farmers in India. They were perfect. They'd be able to see the effect of being rich and poor in each individual. In the Mall experiment, they were looking at the performance of different people. This time, they'd be looking at how the same individual performs in different circumstances.
Because sugarcane farming has harvest only once a year, these are people who find themselves, quote, rich after the harvest when they're getting paid, and poor before harvest.
So Eldar Shafir and his colleagues ran their tests on farmers in the fields near Chennai.
And what you find is when you run them 2 months after harvest, during times of plenty, they perform approximately 9 IQ points better than when you run them 2 months before harvest in times of scarcity.
Like the shoppers in New Jersey, the farmers tended to score well on the tests when they were rich and badly when they were poor. And what made this evidence so compelling was that Eldar Shafir was seeing the change in individuals.
We have the same person, same education, same health. They just do less well under scarcity than under abundance. I'm pretty convinced about what we've done, but that's only a small piece of the puzzle.
These experiments suggest that poverty could change the way you think in the short term. What could it be doing to you in the long term?
Part 2. Malfunction.
I really love hanging out with older adults, and this is how it started.
Our second expert witness, Adina Zeki Al-Hazuri, is a social epidemiologist, which means she studies how society affects our health. Who's the wisest old person you've ever met?
That was my grandfather. He was a nurse, and he's the one who started teaching me English.
Thanks in part to her grandfather's efforts, Adina Zeki Al-Hazuri eventually moved from Lebanon to the US to study and is now an assistant professor at the University of Miami. She studies how brains age. At first she thought her work would all be about studying her favourite kind of people, the elderly. But recently she's done a major piece of work looking at a group of relatively young people, 3,500 adults in the US who were aged between 18 and 30 back in 1985 and who've been tracked ever since. For 2 decades, the subjects reported what income they had.
We looked at the influence of having sustained exposure to low income on brain function.
What Adina Zeki Al-Hazuri and colleagues were trying to work out is whether being in poverty for a sustained period of time has a lasting effect on your brain. They also looked at people who said they felt poor. And all these people were asked to do 3 tests.
3 cognitive tests that are widely used, and they're considered very reliable to detect cognitive aging, meaning they're very sensitive to brain damage, to dementia, to age, etc.
So while our last expert witness was looking at how poverty might use up your mental bandwidth, Adina Zeki Al-Hazuri has been looking at whether it could actually damage your brain. And the results, she says, suggest it might.
We found that individuals who were exposed all the time to poverty over those 20 years performed significantly worse than individuals who were never in poverty.
And those who were in between tended to be affected in proportion to how long they'd lived in poverty.
So the more in poverty, the worse the performance was.
Significantly so.
The magnitude of the associations were sizable, and that tells us that there could be long-term consequences for the effects of poverty on the brain.
Although the difficulty, she admits, is knowing which came first. If your brain doesn't work so well, you might become poorer, rather than the other way round. To try to address that, the researchers then restricted the sample they were looking at to include only people who were in good health at the outset of the study and who were highly educated.
We redid our analyses, and we found the association between poverty and cognitive function remained.
The effect was slightly smaller, but still there. So the trend was apparent even among highly educated people who'd fallen on hard times.
I would say that poverty definitely changes the way we think.
Our expert witness says that cumulative exposure to low income can change the way you think, that poverty, and even just feeling poor, could lead, for some people, to premature aging of the brain. And as our next expert witness argues, it could also affect the way your brain develops in childhood.
Part 3. Arrested Development.
It's heartbreaking, to observe firsthand the impact of deprivation on a child is truly heartbreaking.
Katie McLaughlin, an associate professor of psychology at the University of Washington in the US, focuses her research on children in their early years because that's when the brain is developing the most. She's been studying children in orphanages in Romania.
The institutions themselves, they do not look like places where children should be raised. The walls are barren, there are few toys around, a few adults that will always stick with you.
A Romanian orphanage is not exactly a typical environment. If children there don't do well, it could be for all sorts of reasons, not just that they live in a kind of poverty. But Katie McLaughlin believes her findings do translate.
If we can understand how this extreme form of deprivation impacts the way the brain develops, we may be able to learn something about what's going on in the brains of children who are growing up in poverty.
Her work in Romania has been part of a large study of children who've had their development tracked from a very young age.
The experiment actually involved randomizing children who were growing up in these deprived orphanages, either to be removed from the orphanage and placed into a very high-quality foster care that was designed and supported by the study, or to remain in the institution, and essentially sort of a policy of non-interference to just let that child's life proceed as it would have if the study were not going on.
The basic take-home from this experiment, she says, is that placing a child in a better environment can change the way their brain develops.
You see that the children who were removed from the orphanage, especially if they were removed early in the first few years of life, demonstrate dramatic increases in IQ compared to children who remained in the orphanage for a longer period of time.
Katie McLaughlin says brain scans of those who stayed in the orphanages longer revealed physical evidence of development problems.
We see this thinning of the brain, early thinning, in many different areas.
But especially in the areas which process complex language. In those regions, you see the result of something called synaptic pruning.
The neural circuits and connections that are designed to process that input, when they're not being utilized, they get pruned away. And we think that when this happens continuously and on a large scale, it actually contributes to thinning in the cortex.
She says this thinning of the outer grey matter of the brain, seen in children in Romanian orphanages, has also been found among children in poor areas in the US.
So the idea here is there's an input from the environment that is absent or that is reduced in some way.
Katie McLaughlin thinks the orphanage children's brains have been harmed from their not getting enough stimulation, that they've not been talked to or played with enough. And she thinks to some degree the same may be true for some poor children in the US.
Children growing up in poverty often have less consistent and predictable interactions with adults. That might be because, for example, they have a single parent who has to work rotating shifts at a job in order to make ends meet.
There could be genetics at play here. But Katie McLaughlin says at birth, the brains of children who are born to parents living in poverty look no different to those of children born to wealthier households. The differences emerge in the second year of life, she says. So some children growing up in poverty, you think could grow into adults who then have a harder time finding their way through life, planning for the future, reacting to the world they've got to live in.
Absolutely.
How sure can Katie McLaughlin be that she's proved exactly how poverty might change the way you think? She admits that even the Romanian orphanage study, which she finds compelling, is not hard evidence of cause and effect.
It's difficult to know, right? We can really only make guesses about what the most important ingredient is. If I were to put my money somewhere, I would put it on the absence of a caregiver because of...
But you can't be sure.
We can't be sure.
expert witnesses tell us that poverty can take up headspace, leaving you less room to think, that it could cause the brain to prematurely age and to not develop properly in the first place. But none of them has established a firm causal link between poverty and brain performance. Has anyone? Time for our final expert witness.
Part 4. The Body of Evidence.
First, it is unbelievably loud. There are rickshaws, motor rickshaws, bicycle rickshaws, buses and cars, unbelievable traffic, and everyone's beeping their horn. So there's this din always of loud noise.
Charles Nelson is a professor of pediatrics and neuroscience at Harvard and is running a study investigating the effects of poverty on children in the slums of Bangladesh.
There's a veneer of dust and smog everywhere because many of the roads are unpaved. So there's tremendous air pollution. And then there are open sewers everywhere.
And in the heart of the poorest communities in the capital Dhaka, Charles Nelson's built a state-of-the-art neuroimaging lab.
When some of the babies are 2 to 3 months of age, we do magnetic resonance imaging on them, MRI, when they're sound asleep. When they're 6 months, we can record their electroencephalogram, their EEG, and that reflects the amount of electrical activity in the brain.
He's at the forefront of the research into the effects of poverty on the brain. He's also the person who set up the big study in Romania. But he says it's still early days.
I think that the body of evidence is increasing, but for the most part, I think it's still fairly recent.
And how reliable is the evidence that exists? Has anyone proved that poverty is causing people's brains to change? Or is poverty just associated with these changes?
There is certainly a very strong correlation between poverty and adverse outcomes, biological and neurobiological and behavioral. The extent to which they're causal, I think that evidence is mounting, but still somewhat questionable. We need to wait for further studies to confirm the original findings.
And is it literally the lack of money that could be doing the harm?
Simply not making a certain amount of money doesn't cause anything. It's what not having a certain amount of money is associated with that seems to cause these outcomes. For example, food scarcity. It could include not having good access to health care. It could include high levels of stress in the family, which could in turn present as poor caregiving quality.
So it's not poverty that might be changing your brain. It's the things that often go hand in hand with it. And Charles Nelson says the newest research suggests the care children receive could be the vital element to ensure proper brain development.
Even in poor homes, if the quality of caregiving provided by the mothers or the fathers was very high, you didn't see the cortical thinning. So causally, we should be thinking that simply being poor isn't the causal player here. It's things like being poor leads to being not the best parent you can be that leads to these undesirable outcomes.
If the scientists are right that suffering poverty and its indirect effects might damage your development, what does that mean for the individual? Is that it? You're scarred for life? Some people believe so, but Charles Nelson takes a more optimistic view. Well, a bit more optimistic. He puts hope in the plasticity of the brain, its ability to change and develop.
The brain will always retain some degree of plasticity, and change is possible, but it will require a lot more effort. So it may be that if you wait until the child is 10, you can still get them the help they need and get them back on even keel, but it might require a lot of time and effort and resources to do that.
And as you get older, he says, that plasticity, that ability of your brain to adapt, is much reduced.
It's better to build things right in the beginning than try to rebuild them later.
In one sense, this research is puzzling. It's a fast-growing area of scientific inquiry. But didn't we already know that poverty's bad for you, that it's associated with low educational attainment and a host of other problems? Why do you think the neuroscience of poverty has become so fashionable? Because that's what it feels like it is at the moment.
It's novel. The tools have become more sophisticated that allow us to look at the brain, whereas we couldn't do that even 10 years ago.
And to some, like our expert witness Katie McLaughlin, it seems to offer an irresistible opportunity to find a new way to try to solve an enduring problem. What drew you to this area of study in the first place? Is it the brain and how little we know about it?
Well, for me, actually, I think it's really a question of social justice. How do we understand what creates unequal opportunity? And could we figure out a way to level the playing field and reduce inequalities in the chances for long-term success in life?
And even if the brain science confirms what we already knew, that a life of poverty is bad for you, it might get more attention.
Pretty pictures of the brain seem to trump pictures of starving children. And I think that it brings home to many people that there's a biological toll to growing up poor.
This new field of research and its popularity lead to another question. Is it the place of scientists to tell us what to do about poverty? Isn't that what politicians are for?
If we believe in our science, we have an ethical obligation to work with policymakers and government officials and say, listen, these are things you can do something about. So I'm a little uncomfortable, but not sufficiently uncomfortable to run the other way.
Does poverty change the way you think? A lack of money, our first expert witness argued, can make it hard to think about anything else. Money worries may effectively give you a lower IQ. But in terms of lasting effects, it might not be poverty itself, rather the indirect effects of poverty that are key. There's some evidence that a lack of attention can harm a child's development. More research is needed to be sure. If a poor childhood means mental disadvantage, that raises profound questions. It might become harder to blame people for their poverty, but it might be easier to dismiss the poor. However, if scientists can prove that growing up poor risks damaging your brain, it should serve as a wake-up call to all of us, poor and rich. The inquiry was presented by me, Ruth Alexander. It was produced in London by Simon Mabin and Phoebe Keane. It was mixed by Graham Puddiford. The editor is Hugh Levinson. And if you've been trying to hang on to those 7 numbers, they were 7, 4, 2, 6, 2, 4, 9. I'd also like to recommend another of our BBC World Service podcasts. It's called People Fixing the World, and it's all about the ideas being dreamed up to make the world a better place. And this podcast finds the people trying to solve the world's problems and then investigates whether their projects actually work. Search for People Fixing the World on your podcast app or go to bbcworldservice.com/podcasts.